Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 20th of June of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kharkiv and Zaporozhye. Today very reliable Russian sources published a very interesting article about the current status of the things in the territory of Ukraine. So let's discuss this step by step. According to the source, Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi was given 45 days to organize and prepare a counteroffensive in the Kharkiv region and Zaporozhye. Active preparations are underway. Starting Friday, so tomorrow, a temporary air bridge will be established between the United States and Poland to transport armored vehicles and ammunition. Tanks and infantry fighting vehicles of Swedish, Italian, and Germany production will be transferred by ship from Romania and Bulgaria, probably in direction of Odessa. Storm shadows and attacks missiles are being accumulated. In Kherson and Dnipro, repair shops will be set up in the underground parking lots of shopping centers. Danish and British military doctors are preparing field hospitals in Odessa, Dnipro, Kharkiv, and Nikolaev for 30,000 soldiers. Italy, Croatia, Belgium, and Netherlands are sending 2,300 military doctors and medics to work and train in these field conditions from Monday. Finland and the Baltic countries will send a limited contingent of military specialists to protect these hospitals from the air and organize electronic warfare. So as you can see, that's it. The entire peace summit led by European Union leaders is preparing to give a battle to the Russian armed forces. Most likely the last chance for them and definitely for Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi. Also, we have additional reports from other reliable Russian sources about the same topic, that currently the Ukrainians continue their mobilization process, and Ukrainians, more precisely the recruiters, show significant results of this mobilization. They managed to create this 100,000 soldiers group that are going they're going to use in north and in the south. North it's Kharkiv, Yug is Zaporozhye, Robotyne. Once again, another battle for Robotyne is about to start. The Ukrainians, the Western countries, France, have already started sending in its forces. According to information we have, during the previous months, just in Odessa arrived from 200 till 500 of French, let's say, soldiers or let's say volunteers, and went as for Kharkiv around 300. So the final battle is about to start, and Zelensky is going to show some results. They're planning to show some results before, let's say, NATO summit that is going to take place in July, in the beginning of July. Furthermore, don't forget that also in July and this summit, probably NATO will change its hat, and Stoltenberg will leave his position, and his position will be replaced by the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. So very interesting details are going to start happening these days, but of course the Russians have already prepared very interesting surprises to the Ukrainians. Probably, and the Western countries. Probably the Western countries as well. The Ukrainians didn't expect these surprises. At least they didn't expect that this type of weapon the Russians are going to show them exactly during the possible Ukraine counteroffensive. And of course, we're talking about FAB3000. I expected that Ukrainians would use the Russians would use this FAB3000 probably at the beginning of the Kharkiv offensive operation, but for some reason the Russians decided to keep this weapon as long as possible, and they kept this, let's say, weapon until the beginning of the possible offensive. And today the Russians shown us how does it work and what kind of damage this type of weapon can deal. As you can see, as a result of a strike, the building wasn't ruined, of course, because the Russians didn't hit the building, but I suppose that everything that was located in that building was destroyed. As for Kharkiv direction, we got another very important video from this direction. The Ukrainians continue concentration of HIMARS systems in this area, and for example, on this video we can see how the Ukrainians were bombing Vovchansk and Belgorod using this type of weapon, but the Russians managed to discover the movements of Kharkiv, of HIMARS system, and then as a result of Russian strike, the HIMARS system was destroyed. If we move back on map, we're gonna see this is the explosion of HIMARS system. I would like to point your attention. So if we return back on map, the Russians discovered the HIMARS system here. The HIMARS system was attacking the territory of Russian Federation in the vicinity of the village Shiroka, and then that HIMARS system entered this forest, and then this system was destroyed as a result of Russian maybe Iskander strike, or maybe as a result of Russian Lancet strike. So the Ukrainians concentrated a lot of weapons, a lot of forces, a lot of soldiers, and the most important about the concentration of forces, today we also got very interesting report from the borders between Belarus and Ukraine, and according to information we have, Ukraine is pulling forces to the border with Belarus. According to the country's border committee of Belarus, the HIMARS systems, Bradley's infantry fighting vehicles, M777 howitzers, Gepard air defense systems, and units of special operation forces of main intelligence directorate of Ukraine are concentrated in the adjacent territory. So I'm not sure what the Ukrainians are planning to do with this. Maybe they're just trying to secure the border in case if the Russians are going to attack Ukraine when everything, let's say, goes wrong, let's say on the borderlands with Belgorod and Kharkiv. A lot of opinions. Ukrainians just want to be on the safe side and not to miss attack in Kiev from behind. Anyway, let's return back to Kharkiv direction. I'll remind you that during the previous few weeks, the Ukrainians adopted very important law. They started mobilizations among the prisoners. And significant number of prisoners were mobilized, and most of them have already passed the basic trainings, the basic military, let's say, exercises, and these soldiers were sent already in Kharkiv direction. And according to information we have, the Ukrainians are planning to use prisoners as a first wave of war, as the first wave of offensive operation. So I'm not sure about the exact number of the prisoners and who that will be involved in the first phase of Kharkiv counteroffensive operation, which is going to be the first part of Ukrainian, the second greatest counteroffensive operation since the beginning of the special military operation. But as I understand, according to information we have, there are already up to 5,000 prisoners along the line of combat contact in Kharkiv area. So around 1 battalion of stormtroopers have already arrived in this area. And as for these, let's say, prisoner stormtroopers, today the Russian sources published the video of how these stormtroopers, former prisoners, were trying to attack the Russian positions, more precisely to get in the area of destroyed bridge between north and the south of Vovchansk. The Russians, of course, discovered some movements and they start bombing and attacking them. And later the Russians made their own statement, and according to that's very funny, we can say, operation, the Ukrainians lost the entire group of, let's say, former prisoners. So the Russians are trying to tell us that the level of experience of these prisoners are very low, and it's not going to be a very big problem for them. But it's just one case from, let's say, of 5,000 soldiers, so everything can be. As for north of Vovchansk, the clashes in this area continues. According to information we have, currently the Russians are focused in this area. They're trying to capture this forest, the last stronghold, the last, let's say, position of armed forces of Ukraine in this part of Vovchansk. Some Russian mappers reported that the Russians managed to establish complete control over every single building in the southern part of the north of Vovchansk. So summarizing everything, by the evening, by the time I start making the video, the Russians have already established complete control over these territories. So this is the, let's say, approximately the line of combat contact. The Ukrainians were controlled just this forest, and now the Russians are trying to storm this area. And we have already receiving some videos of how the Russians were bombing and attacking this territory, probably with the purpose to force the Ukrainians to fall back or to destroy those who were in this area, at least during the previous few days. As for Vovchansk aggregatny plant, we haven't received anything. The clashes in this area continues. We got a lot of videos of how the Russians were bombing the citadel with source flamethrower systems, but regarding the number of strikes, regarding the number of weapons and the types of weapons that were used during the previous days, we still see that there is no progress on the ground. The Russians are not pushing, they're waiting. The Russians mainly are waiting when the Ukrainians are going to launch their greatest offensive. And I'll remind you, I believe you remember this, and if we increase the numbers of this since the beginning of these months, we're going to receive, and we received significant number of photos, significant number of geolocations showing us that the Russians have been building a lot of fortifications, a lot of strongholds in this area. The video was published by different Ukrainian sources of how they were hunting and destroying the Russian Russian engineering machine. So as I understand, today the 20th of June, the Russians began their offensive on the 10th of May. So for 1 month and 10 days, most likely the Russians managed to prepare significant number of fortifications. Of course, there is not like very strong, but trenches, very deep trenches were built, and there is a lot of this type of, let's say, strongholds. So the Russians do have nice background to repel any possible Ukrainian counterattack. And as for the current situation in the eastern part, today the Ukrainian sources published the video how they were attacking and storming the Russian forces in this area with the force of 36th Marine Brigade. And as a result of those attacks, the Ukrainians managed to restore control over some positions. So this yellow cloud was recaptured by the Ukrainians during the previous few days. As for the eastern part, as you can see, we have adjusted the map in the vicinity of the village by the name of Tikha and Zybina, and these are not the territories that the Ukrainians managed to restore control over as a result of counterattacks. This territory was in the gray zone, but not even in the gray zone. This territory was in contested area without any proofs whether the Russians entered this territory or not. And now we got lots of also updates from different mappers that confirms that this territory that the Russians haven't entered this territory since the beginning of the Kharkiv offensive. So that's why we just returned back the color of yellow, because we didn't have any proofs that the Russians entered this area. As for Liptsi, once again, the Russians used for the first time FAB3000 in this area. The Russians are ready to meet any Ukrainian offensive. These days, Putin is flying all over the world, trying to sign some contracts and agreements with different countries, most likely in military sphere. The Russians need lots of, let's say, munition, lots of equipment. They need lots of rocket missiles. The Russians need lots of, let's say, 152 artillery shells, and most likely Putin signed everything he needs, and now the Russians are ready and completely prepared before any possible offensive operation from the NATO countries. Obviously, the next few days are going to be very important and very interesting. Now let's move further in the southern direction. Let's go step by step. According to information we have, as a result of offensive, the Russians entered the village by the name of Pishana and forced the Ukrainians to fall back from the southern part. We received this update from not very reliable source, so for now we're going to keep the area as is, but we'll just keep in our minds that maybe something interesting is happening there. Now we're moving further in the southern direction. Today, Deep State Map confirmed additional Russian progress between Plasyanka and Makiivka, just regular movements of the Russian forces without anything significant. As for Siversk direction, during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received lots of very interesting updates, just another batch of the videos of how the Russians were FPV droning the Ukrainians inside of the village by the name of Sporne. Few more strikes, FPV drone attacks, without any changes on the ground and without any attempts to attack the territory with infantry or, let's say, armored vehicles or personnel carriers. The Russians continue controlling the main supply roads that goes from Siversk to Razdolovka. Another day brought us another batch of the videos of how the Russians were hunting and destroying the Ukrainian vehicles that were heading towards Razdolovka or evacuating the personnel from Razdolovka to Siversk. So lots of vehicles were destroyed once again. A small, let's say, cauldron or small operational encirclement in this area we can see. As for Chasiv Yar, the Russians are not moving at all. We just got a few videos from this area of how the Ukrainians were redeploying and moving additional reinforcements and reserves from the central Chasiv Yar to the eastern block, which confirms that Ukrainians still have possibilities to support their forces in the Chasiv Yar citadel, and that means that the battle for this territory is going to be very long because of existing of Ukrainian supply roads. As for northern part, we got a lot of videos confirming that the Russians control most of Kalinovka, including the area in the vicinity of Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. We have the videos that were published by the Ukrainian forces. Now let's move to Toretsk direction. During the previous few days, we got significant number of reports and updates about the Russian offensive from Mayorsk to Druzhba and from Novobakhmutovka to Alexandropol, but we got the reports just for, let's say, maybe 6-7 hours. And as for today, according to the Ukrainian sources, they managed to stabilize the situation completely. Since the beginning of this operation, we haven't received even a single geolocated video confirmation of any attempts to attack from the Russian side. And After complete absence of any information, we receive report from the Ukrainians that everything is okay right now. So very weird and very interesting situation. Now let's move to Western Avdiivka area. According to information we have, according to some Russian resources, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the stronghold that lays in the northern part of Sokol. So this territory from now on under complete Russian control. Yet we haven't received any geolocations confirming this. So let's wait a bit before we receive the same reports from more or less reliable resources. The Russians began artillery preparation in direction of Kalinova. They were bombing and attacking this territory with multiple launch rocket systems, and this is something like artillery preparation before further possible offensive operation in this area. It's very difficult to understand where the Russians are going to attack exactly, but they're attacking and bombing the territory around the, let's say, the line of combat contact, just with the purpose to stretch Ukrainian artillery forces and maybe to move the Ukraine attention from primary directions to the secondary. As for Novosilovka Persha, we got significant number of geolocations, as you can see. The Russians continue hunting and destroying Ukraine vehicles, trucks, armored vehicles, personnel carriers. As we know, this territory is under the responsibilities of the 47th Mechanized Brigade. There are a lot of forces. There were a lot of forces concentrated in this area, including significant number of armored vehicles of Western production. And during the previous days, the Russians destroyed lots of this weapon and equipment, and they continue doing the same, but without any changes on the ground. As for Karlovka, we got the final confirmation that the Russians captured this territory and entered this residential part of northern Karlovka from the southeast. We got this update a few days ago. Some mappers have already adjusted their maps, but just today we got the geolocated confirmation. So the battle for this area continues, but most likely the Russians are not going to move further due to the existence of this stronghold that located on the right side, on the left side of Karlovka water reservoir. As for Georgievka and South Donetsk direction, we haven't received almost anything from this area, just the regular activity of how the Russians were clearing the tree lines, preparing the foothold for further offensive towards Maximilianovka and Kurakhova. The Russians continue hunting and bombing the Ukrainian forces in the western Konstantinovka. Currently, this is more or less secure area of, if we can call this area secured, and let's say because this part of Konstantinovka is located very far from the main line of combat contact between Novomikhailivka, so this is the area of main concentration of Ukrainian forces, but without any changes on the ground. As a result of few attempts to attack, the Russians managed to improve their positions on the line between Salotka and Vadiane, and but according to the Ukrainian forces, if you remember, we were talking about this case a lot. Some Ukrainians were encircled in this part, but according to information we have, they managed to break through the encirclement and to, let's say, move towards their main positions and move towards the, let's say, village by the name of Vadiane and the strongholds here. So there is no more encirclement according to Ukrainian sources. As for Rajayna and Staromayorsk, as you can see from village itself, we haven't received anything. The most important updates are coming from the territory in the northern part. We got significant number of arrivals, lots of, let's say, FABs. The Russians were bombing Ukrainian positions. The main supply roads, probably preparing the foothold for further offensive, because the Russians stopped any offensives in this area a few days ago. Currently there is operational pause. The Russians are bringing artillery closer, some munition, some ammo depots, and some fresh forces, and most likely within the next few days the Russians will renew their offensive. As for Zaporozhye, as we discussed in the previous update, the Ukrainians, probably according to the post we read at the beginning of the video, are planning to renew their attempts to attack on the line between Novodianovka and the town by the name of Tokmak. So this is the primary target for them, and or the Ukrainians may try to attack the Russians on the line between Stepnogorsk and Vasilievka, because as for this territory, during the previous month, starting of May, we start receiving significant number of geolocations from this territory, and mainly from the Russian side, of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces in Petykhatki, Stepova, and Plany and Verkhnye Kamyanska, and so on. So which confirms that there is some concentration of Ukrainian forces, and maybe the Ukrainians are planning to use this road for further offensive on the line along the Dnipro River, or the things that left from Dnipro River on the line Stepnogorsk, Vasilievka, then Skelki, Dniprudne, and then in direction of Energodar. Because according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours the Ukrainians attacked Energodar. Maybe they were trying to suppress some positions, air defenses, systems or something like this. As for Kherson direction, we haven't received a lot of interesting updates, just the regular activity. The Ukrainians are hunting the Russian FPV drone positions, the Russians are hunting the Ukrainian FPV drone positions. As you can see, no changes on the ground, nothing special. As for Odessa, as we discussed in the previous post, the Ukrainians are building the field medicine centers, hospitals to receive up to 30,000 soldiers, 30,000 wounded soldiers that Ukrainians can have as a result of offensive in Kharkiv and in Zaporozhye direction. So most likely the next few weeks are going to be very interesting, and according to that report, once again, if the doctors and medics are going to arrive in this area starting from next Monday, that means that somewhere by the end of the next weeks, the Ukrainians will be ready to begin their offensive right before the NATO summit that is going to take place in Washington this July. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.